What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. This is Guys That Magic, and I'm your host, Dave. Today I'm going to be taking you through a deck tech of the freshly spoiled Queen Kayla bin-Kroog. She is a red and a white for a total of 3 mana. She's a legendary creature human noble. You can pay 4 mana and tap her to discard all the cards in your hand, then draw that many cards. You may choose an artifact or creature card with mana value 1 you discarded this way, then do the same for artifact or creature cards with mana values 2 and 3. Return those cards to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. And then lastly, of course, she's a 2/3. Now, I was really excited whenever I saw this card get spoiled because I think that this is a very interesting and somewhat unique direction to take Boros. Generally speaking, we happen to see Boros commanders as just caring about combat or making a lot of tokens and swinging sideways. So having a commander that works a little bit differently here and focusing on being able to board state through different means, I think is super cool, very unique. The way that this deck is going to work is we're actually going to be focusing primarily on using her ability to cheat out artifacts and to be able to punish our opponents with that, either by creating locks for our opponent, that way our opponents can't win the game, or just by generating a massive amount of mana and then being able to capitalize off of that. Now, I do apologize. I'm not going to be able to take you through this deck tech the way that I generally do, where I talk about creatures and planeswalkers and so forth and so on. And the reason being for it is because this deck is a little bit more on the complicated side. There's a couple of loops that I do need to take you through first in order for you to really understand how this deck is going to function. So if you're not a big fan of artifact-heavy decks, this is probably not going to be for you. And if you're not a big fan of being able to combo out, same kind of thing. This is a commander that's just got a really powerful ability on her. She allows us to dig through our deck lightning fast, and then whenever we are discarding cards, we can be able to just kind of like cheat them into play oftentimes. So she makes for a wonderful, wonderful combo-based commander. The first combo that we are going to talk about involves Basalt Monolith. This is 3 mana for an artifact. It says that it doesn't untap during your untap step. You can tap it to add 3 colorless mana, and you can pay 3 mana to untap it. Now, on its own, it doesn't really do a whole lot other than just serve as a mana rock, but you can partner it up with Rings of Brighthearth. That's a 3 mana artifact, and it says whenever you activate an ability, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 2. If you do, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, we can't actually copy the adding 3 mana from the Basalt Monolith because that is a mana ability, but we can copy the untap ability on Basalt Monolith. So with these 2 cards in play, the way that it'll work is you'll tap Basalt Monolith to add 3 mana. You'll then pay 3 mana to untap Basalt Monolith, and then pay 2 extra mana to activate the Rings of Brighthearth. By doing so, you are going to copy the untap ability on Basalt Monolith. It means that it should have the ability to untap twice for just 3 mana. Whenever you untap it the first time, you'll tap it back down to net 3 mana, and then it will untap due to the second trigger. With that being said, this is going to generate an infinite amount of mana, so you should be able to do, well, any kind of crazy shenanigans with infinite amounts of mana. If you do want to make this even more deadly, we do have Sensei's Divining Top in the deck as well. This is a single mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 to look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put them back in any order. You can also tap it, draw a card, then put Sensei's Divining Top on the top of its owner's library. Once you have an infinite supply of mana, you can use Sensei's Divining Top and the Rings of Brighthearth to actually copy that draw ability on Sensei's Divining Top. This means that you would tap it, draw a card, and then put Sensei's Divining Top back on the top of your library, then draw a card, then put Sensei's Divining Top back on the top of your library. But the second card that you drew would have been Sensei's Divining Top, which you can recast because you have infinite amounts of mana. Essentially now the way that this works is not only do you have all the mana you will ever need, but you can draw your entire deck. So these 3 cards together, pretty nasty. If that's not enough for you, we also have Staff of Domination included in this deck, which goes wild with this combo as well. For 3 mana, you get an artifact and it has 5 different abilities on it. You can pay 1 mana to untap it. You can pay 2 mana and tap it to gain 1 life. Pay 3 mana and tap it to untap target creature. 4 mana and tap it to tap target creature, and 5 mana and tap it to draw a card. Similarly to Sensei's Divining Top, so long as you have an infinite amount of mana, you can draw your entire deck with it. You can also gain an infinite amount of life with Staff of Domination. And another really cool thing that you can do is you can untap and tap your commander over and over and over again, activating her ability to be able to just cheat whatever you want into play. So that is the first complicated loop that I'm going to take you through. There are a couple more. The next one that I'm going to talk about is a loop that utilizes a card called Mystic Forge. This is 4 mana for an artifact that says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast artifact spells and colorless spells from the top of your library. You can also tap it and pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library. Now, the reason why this card is so incredibly powerful is because it also goes absolutely bonkers with Sensei's Divining Top. Mystic Forge and Sensei's Divining Top are really powerful whenever you combine them with one of a couple of other cards that are also going to be thrown into this deck. The first one here is Foundry Inspector. It's 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature construct. It says artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Cloud Key is 3 mana for an artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. Lastly here we have Joyra's Familiar. This is 4 mana for an artifact creature bird. It's a 2/2 with flying that says historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So if we do happen to have Mystic Forge as well as one of those other 3 cards that I just mentioned in play, we can use Sensei's Divining Top ability to be able to draw a card off the top of our library, then pay 0 for the cost reduction to put Sensei's Divining Top in play from the top of our library. This allows us to be able to not only recast Sensei's Divining Top a lot of times, as many times as we have cards left in the deck, but it does allow us to potentially draw the entire deck. Now, since we are going to be casting so many versions of Sensei's Divining Top, another piece that works really wonderfully well here is Aetherflux Reservoir. This is 4 mana for an artifact. It says whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. You can also pay 50 life, and Aetherflux Reservoir deals 50 damage to target creature or player. This is essentially the Death Star, and you're going to be blowing your opponents up with it. Now, super important here is we've already talked about 2 different loops that will gain you massive amounts of life. Staff of Domination can just straight up go infinite, and Aetherflux Reservoir goes absolutely nutty with the Sensei's Divining Top loop, where we can continue to cast it over and over and over again, gaining us more and more life each time we do. The third loop that we're going to talk about, and probably the most complicated of all of these, involves the card Krark-Clan Ironworks. This is 4 mana for an artifact. It says sacrifice an artifact, add 2 mana to your mana pool. Now, if you watched Modern for very long, or if you did happen to play this deck a couple years ago, you may remember this. This card popped up and became an absolute menace in the format. Krark-Clan Ironworks with Scrap Trawler, which is an artifact creature construct, costs 3 mana. It's a 3/2, and it says whenever it or another artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. Also important to this loop, we do have Mirror Retriever, which is 2 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature mirror. It says whenever it dies, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. And Junk Diver, which is 3 mana for an artifact creature bird. It's a 1/1 with flying. It says whenever it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, in order to make this work, you are also going to need a 1 mana artifact. In this case, I'm just going to use Soul Ring. Soul Ring on its own, just a single mana, you can tap it to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Now, if you do happen to have a 1 mana artifact, such as Soul Ring in the graveyard, as well as either Mirror Retriever or Junk Diver in the graveyard, both Scrap Trawler and Krark-Clan Ironworks in play, the way that this works is that you can sacrifice one of either Mirror Retriever or Junk Diver to Krark-Clan Ironworks to net 2 mana. Their trigger will go off in the stack, allowing you to grab an artifact card from the graveyard, and Scrap Trawler's ability will also go off, allowing you to grab an additional artifact card from the graveyard. You're going to want to juggle these cards. That way you're grabbing both a copy of either Mirror Retriever or Junk Diver and Soul Ring. That way you can continue to bring them back and juggle them onto the battlefield. You're going to continue then to sacrifice them with Krark-Clan Ironworks. Essentially the way that this is going to work is you're going to have an infinite amount of ETBs, or at least until you decide to stop using this combo, and you'll also end up with an infinite amount of mana. It is all colorless mana in this instance since we're using Soul Ring for the example, but even still, that should be enough for you to just be able to completely obliterate your opponents. Just absolutely go nuts with what this deck can do. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about, although not necessarily a combo, is a high synergy play that you can make, and it is going to be one of the primary ways where you can just absolutely obliterate your opponents. This involves our first Planeswalker that we're going to talk about. This is Karn, the Great Creator. For 4 mana, you got a legendary planeswalker. It's Karn. He comes in with 5 starting loyalty and has an ability on him stating that activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. He's got a +1 that says until your next turn, up to 1 target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. And a -2 that says you may choose an artifact card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card, and put it into your hand. Now, the way the EDH works is you can't actually use that -2 to just go grab whatever random card was laying around on your coffee table, but you can still be able to pull cards from exile, so it is still somewhat relevant, at least some of the time. Now, we can use Karn with Mycosynth Lattice, another card in the deck. This is a 6 mana artifact. It says all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. All cards that aren't on the battlefield, spells, and permanents are colorless, and players may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. Now, the reason why these cards work really well together is because Karn's passive ability of activated abilities or artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. Well, Mycosynth Lattice drops and actually makes all of our opponents' lands artifacts. And Karn doesn't have the safety valve printed on him of activated abilities that are not mana abilities, like what we've seen before. So with that being said, if you have Karn and Mycosynth Lattice in play, not only does it shut down all of the activated abilities of any permanent they have in play, it actually also turns off their lands. They can no longer tap their lands for mana. To make this even nastier, there's 2 other cards that we have included in the deck. The first one here is Darksteel Forge. This is a 9 mana artifact, and it says artifacts you control have indestructible. With Mycosynth Lattice in play, every permanent is an artifact, which means all of our permanents now gain indestructible. Nevinral's Disc is going to be included in here as well. This is 4 mana for an artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 1, tap it, destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Now, since we made all permanents artifacts and all our permanents are indestructible, what we essentially just do here is we blow up all of our opponents' permanents, lands included. The other really nasty thing about this is that you don't actually have to sacrifice Nevinral's Disc to activate the ability. It's implied that Nevinral's Disc would be blowing itself up in the process, but Darksteel Forge actually prevents that from happening, so you can repeat this ability over and over and over again. This essentially creates a lock where your opponents just cannot play the game anymore. So, thank you for bearing with me. Those are going to be our main kill conditions for the deck. With that being said, we're going to jump into the actual goodies and the additional support that's going to make this deck really hum. This first category, these are going to be creatures, and specifically artifact creatures that we want to see over the course of the game. The first one here is going to be Esper Sentinel. It's a single white mana for an artifact creature human soldier. It's a 1/1 and says whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. We love to draw cards in just about every deck, and the fact of the matter with this one is that if we have a full hand, we can just keep pitching our hand to the graveyard using our commander's ability and being able to cheat the cost on some of the cards that we want to be able to just get into play. Aethersworn Canonist is a fun one here. Since we are going to be running so many artifacts, she doesn't really hurt us a whole lot. This is 1 and a white for an artifact creature human cleric. She's a 2/2 and says each player who has cast a non-artifact spell this turn can't cast additional non-artifact spells. Do keep in mind there is the potential for you to be able to shut yourself down with Aethersworn Canonist, but since you are playing an artifact-based deck, chances are this is going to hurt your opponents a lot more than it will you. Lion Sash is 1 and a white for an artifact creature equipment cat. It's a 1/1. You can pay a single white mana and it says exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and it's got the reconfigure cost of 2. I wanted to include this into the deck because in the case we are playing up against some graveyard shenanigans, Lion Sash does a really good job of shutting that down. Steel Overseer is 2 mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 1/1 and says you can tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. And Chief of the Foundry is 3 mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 2/3. It says other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. These are both going to be really powerful in the case that we do need to switch over to the beatdown plan and just hope that we can start killing our opponents with all the small little things that we've cheated into play. As far as some of the other creatures in this deck, this next category are not going to be artifact creatures, but they're going to be creatures that are going to help us out with that artifact theme. The first one here is Goblin Welder. This is a single red mana for a 1/1. It's a creature Goblin Artificer. It has a tap ability that says, choose target artifact a player controls and target artifact card in that player's graveyard. If both targets are still legal as this ability resolves, that player simultaneously sacrifices the artifact and returns the artifact card to the battlefield. The way that this works is essentially what we're going to do is we're going to be dumping our hand, and if you haven't noticed, we do have a couple of really expensive artifacts in our deck. Goblin Welder allows us to be able to switch one of those cheaper artifacts with one of our much more expensive artifacts we may have pitched to our graveyard that our commander would not be able to bring in. Felden of the Third Path is 1 and 2 red for a legendary creature Human Artificer. He's got an ability where you can pay 2 and a red, tap him. It says, create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So it's not going to be able to recur artifacts just in general, but it can grab some of those artifact creatures, which might be able to help us out a little bit. Goblin Engineer is 1 and a red for a creature Goblin Artificer. It's a 1/2. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card, put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. You can also pay a red, tap it, sacrifice an artifact, and return target artifact card with a converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So he works kind of similarly to Goblin Welder. There is a mana value restriction placed on Goblin Engineer that you do need to be very aware of, but it's still a nice recursion piece. Audacious Reshapers is 2 and a red for a creature Human Artificer. It's a 3/3 and it says you can tap it and sacrifice an artifact, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way. Chances are this probably isn't going to hurt you for a whole lot because we do have so many artifacts in play, and this might be a way for us to be able to luck into one of our more expensive artifacts. Oswald Fiddlebender is 1 and a white for a legendary creature Gnome Artificer. It's a 2/2 with an ability called Magical Tinkering. You can pay a white, tap it, and sacrifice an artifact to search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. We do have a couple of artifacts in our deck that do have a mana value of 4 that we really want to be able to get into play, and Oswald Fiddlebender does a great job of that, just because we do have a lot of 1, 2, and 3 drops, 2 and 3 drops specifically in this deck that we want to be able to cheat in with our commander, but she can't hit anything higher than that. Lastly, here in the support package, we have Osgear, the Reconstructor. He is 2, a red and a white for a legendary creature Giant Artificer. He's a 4/4 with Vigilance and says you can pay 1, sacrifice an artifact, and target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. You can also pay X, tap, and exile an artifact with mana value X from your graveyard. Create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled artifact and activate only as a sorcery. So a nice little fun piece of recursion here, as well as potentially being able to bump up our team if we ever need to go in for combat damage. The next group of creatures here are all going to be just kind of dorks that we've included into the deck, some things that help us be able to generate large amounts of mana relatively quickly. The first one is Palladium Mirror. This is 3 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It's a 2/2. You can tap it and add 2 colorless mana. Iron Mirror is 2 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature mirror. You can tap it to add a red mana to your mana pool. Gold Mirror is 2 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It's a 1/1. You can tap it to add a white mana to your mana pool. And Ornithopter of Paradise is 2 mana for an artifact creature Thopter. It's a 0/2 with flying that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. To wrap up the rest of our creatures, these are going to be some of our larger haymakers or more impactful creatures that we can summon. The first one here is Steel Hellkite. This is 6 mana for an artifact creature dragon. It's a 5/5 with flying. It's got an ability where you can pay 2 mana to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. It also has another ability where you can pay X, destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activated only once each turn. We do have a couple of infinite mana engines in the deck. Steel Hellkite has the ability to pump itself with those, so it could turn into a one-shot kill. In addition to that, it's a big dragon, it's a big artifact, and it can also act as a pseudo removal piece. I love this card in the deck. Platinum Angel is 7 mana for an artifact creature angel. She's a 4/4 with flying. She says you cannot lose the game and your opponents cannot win the game. Nice, short, sweet, simple, and this shuts down most of those instant win combos that your opponents might be running. Wormcoil Engine is 6 mana for an artifact creature worm. It's a 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink. It says whenever it dies, put a 3/3 colorless worm artifact creature token with Death Touch and a 3/3 colorless worm artifact creature token with Lifelink onto the battlefield. We're also going to include Lashiel, Clockwork Scholar. This is 2 and a white for a legendary creature, Elephant Artificer. It's a 2/4. It says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control. It also says whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Lashiel is not going to go infinite because its ability only draws us 1 card per turn, but I think it's still really important. Not only does it have that pseudo kind of combat clause in there in case we do need to start turning our creatures sideways, but it'll also help to make sure our hand is at least kind of growing and making sure that we can continuously be using our commander's ability to discard cards. Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle, is 3 and a white. It's a legendary creature bird cleric. It's a 2/2 with flying, and it says whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. We have a ton of historic spells, and a lot of them are also creatures. So Teshar is super powerful in this list, especially if you can get something like Krark-Clan Ironworks in play so that you can start sacrificing things. If you can create some loops there, she's nice and fun. Hellkite Tyrant is in this deck as an alternative win condition. This is 4 and 2 red. It's a creature dragon. It's a 6/5 with flying and trample, and it says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. Although not necessarily going to be something that's just going to outright kill your opponents, but something to keep in mind is that if you do play Mycosynth Lattice, it turns all of their permanents into artifacts, so if Hellkite Tyrant can connect, you'll just gain control of their entire board. Lastly in here, we have Sun Titan. This is 4 and 2 white for a creature giant. It's a 6/6 with Vigilance, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a super efficient recursion piece here. That's going to wrap it up for our creatures. Next up, we're going to move over and talk about some of the instants and sorceries in the deck. The first 2 sorceries I'm going to talk about are focused about card draw. The first one here is going to be Faithless Looting, which is a single red mana. It says draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and it's got a flashback of 2 and a red. So in the case that we do discard it with our commander, we can use its ability later on. Thrilling Discovery is a red and a white for a sorcery. It says you gain 2 life, discard 2 cards. If you do, you draw 3 cards. Some of our bigger sorceries in this deck, these are going to focus a little bit more on some of the recursion aspects that we want to pull from. The first one and the biggest is going to be Wake the Past. This is 5, a red, and a white for a total of 7 mana. It says return all artifact cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. They gain haste until end of turn. Not just artifact creature cards in there as well. So in the case that we do happen to dump over a ton of artifacts, which our commander most certainly will, Wake the Past is a huge swing for us. Open the Vaults is pretty similar. This is 4 and 2 white for a sorcery. It says return all artifact and enchantment cards from all graveyards to the battlefield under their owner's control. Now, important to note there is your opponents are going to be able to capitalize on Open the Vaults as well. We're just hoping that we are discarding or filling our graveyard up a little bit bigger and a little bit faster than they are capable of. Trash for Treasure is 2 and a red for a sorcery. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact. Return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So kind of similar to the little goblins we mentioned earlier, Trash for Treasure is going to want to trade off one of our smaller artifacts that may not be doing a whole lot for us for one of the big ones that are going to be able to help us close out the game. Savine's Reclamation is 2 and a white for a sorcery. It says return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy this spell and choose new targets for the copy. It's also got a flashback of 4 and a white that we can use from the graveyard. Lastly here we have Past in Flames. This is 3 and a red for a sorcery. It says each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost, and this itself also has flashback for 4 and a red. Now, obviously, we're not a spell slinging deck. We don't really care a whole lot about instants and sorceries, but I really want to be able to make sure we use Wake the Past in the case that we mill it over. So Past in Flames, having the flashback cost on it, allows us to be able to still use Wake the Past or Open the Vaults, even if we mill them out. As far as our instants are going to be focused in this deck, the first 3 are going to be focused primarily just on single target removal. We have Swords to Plowshares, a single white mana for an instant, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Path to Exile, which is a single white mana for an instant, exile target creature. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And we also have Generous Gift in here. This is 2 and a white for an instant. destroy target permanent, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. As a little bit more of a flexible option, we're also going to include Boros Charm. This is a red and white. For an instant, it says choose one. It deals 4 damage to target player, or permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn, or target creature gains double strike until end of turn. The removal portion on this is good whenever you really need it as a panic button. The ability to give all permanents you control indestructible is very relevant in this deck. We don't want our opponents blowing up our board, and more importantly than that, if we do happen to have Boros Charm in our hand and an Avenral's Disc in play, they could easily turn into a, well, one-sided board wipe that we don't have to face the repercussions of. I have 2 more oddballs in this deck. I have a single enchantment and 1 more planeswalker to talk about. The first enchantment we're going to talk about is Gear per Aether Grid. This is 2 and a red for an enchantment that says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. It deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So this is just going to be another way for us to be able to close out the game a little bit more quickly in the case that we're just flooding out and not assembling any of our locks or combos. We also have Daretti Scrap Savant as the additional planeswalker here. He is 3 and a red for a legendary planeswalker. Daretti comes in with 3 loyalty. His first ability is a +2 that says discard up to 2 cards and draw that many cards. His -2 says sacrifice an artifact. If you do, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And he has an ultimate at -10 that says you get an emblem with whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So a very hard recursion there. Jumping into some of the additional artifacts, the next group that we're going to talk about, these are going to be mainly focused on just making the deck hum a little bit better, or helping us out with a different avenue that maybe isn't necessarily super important with one of the combos we mentioned earlier. The first 3 cards they're going to get in here all have something in common, and that is that they help our commander to untap. 1000-Year Elixir is 3 mana for an artifact. It says you may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. You can also pay 1 mana and tap the 1000-Year Elixir to untap target creature. So our commander more than likely is going to be the target of this. Patriarch's Seal is 3 mana for an artifact. It's got an ability where you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You can also pay 1, tap it, and untap target legendary creature you control. Lastly, included in this category, we have Magerite Stone. This is 2 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to untap target creature that has an activated ability with a tap in its cost. So all 3 of these cards will allow us to untap our commander and potentially refire something. Our next little group over here is going to be just artifacts going to help us out with our mana production. I'm going to include Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, Thought Vessel, Boros Signet, and Talisman of Conviction. Essentially now, these all are just going to tap for mana. You're probably pretty familiar with these cards, so I'm not going to dive in with what they do individually. The last little category here are going to be just some fun artifacts and things that I think the deck could probably benefit from having. The first one is Karn's Silex. This is 3 mana for a legendary artifact. It says it enters the battlefield tapped. Players can't pay life to cast spells or activated abilities that aren't mana abilities, and you can pay X and tap it to exile Karn's Silex and then destroy each downland permanent with mana value X or less, activate only as a sorcery. This acts as a little bit of a stacks piece. There's a lot of things in EDH that do require life to be paid, so this shuts those down hard, and in the case that we need it, it can also function as a kind of a board wipe. Crawl Space is going to be making the list. It is 3 mana for an artifact. It says no more than 2 creatures can attack you each combat. So hopefully your opponents can't be able to hit in with anything really all that big or impactful. If you haven't noticed, we don't have a ton of real big smashy creatures, and we kind of want to be left alone, so Crawl Space is a nice inclusion here. Ichor Wellspring is 2 mana for an artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. With our ability to sacrifice artifacts, this is wonderful for us. It's basically 2 mana, draw 2 cards, and then hopefully be able to cheat something nice and big into play from our graveyard. Lastly here we have Crucible of Worlds. This is 3 mana for an artifact. It says you may play land cards from your graveyard. This is probably the most important of the group here because it functions as 2 pivotal pieces for us. The first part here is that our commander is going to be dumping a massive amount of lands into our graveyard, so Crucible of Worlds means that we can still continue to play with those. The second thing that makes this card really powerful is that in the case that we do happen to have lands in our hands, we don't actually have to play those. We can add those to our hand count, which is going to allow us to discard a little bit more using our commander to hopefully draw a couple more cards. Talking about some of those lands though, we're going to jump over and talk about the mana base. The first card here that I'm going to talk about is Battlefield Forge. This is a land that you can tap to add either a colorless, or you can tap it, have it deal 1 damage to you, and it'll add either a red or a white. Spectator Seeding is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, and you can tap it for either a red or a white. Sacred Foundry is the shock land of these colors. We're going to be throwing it in this list as well. It's a land that is a mountain and plains. You can have it enter the battlefield tapped, or you can have it enter the battlefield untapped if you pay 2 life. Command Tower is a land that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color of your commander's color identity. Needle Verge Pathway is one of the Zendikar Pathway lands. You can have it either enter on the front half or the back half, and then it will tap for a red or white, respectively. Clifftop Retreat is the check land of these colors. It says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a plains. You can tap either for a red or a white. Temple of Triumph is a land that enters the battlefield tapped. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, and then later on you can tap it for either a red or a white. Rugged Prairie is a land that you can tap for a colorless mana. You can also pay either a white or a red and tap it, and if you do, you'll add either red, white, or white-red to your mana pool. Sundown Pass enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands, but aside from that, it can tap for a red or a white. We have a couple spaces in here for some utility lands that I thought were really important. The first one is Buried Ruin. This is a land that you can tap to add either a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and tap it, sacrifice it, and return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Inventor's Fair is a legendary land. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life. You can tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool. You can also pay for, tap it, and sacrifice it to search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. You can only activate this ability if you control 3 or more artifacts, but it should be pretty easy to do with this deck. War Room is a land that you can tap to add a single colorless mana for. You can also pay 3, tap it, and pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity. Draw a card. And lastly here we have Spire of Industry. This is land that you can tap to add either a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it and pay 1 life to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Activate this only if you control an artifact. To wrap up the rest of this deck, we're going to be including 10 plains and 10 mountains, and that's going to finish up with the rest of our mana base. All in all, this deck is primarily focused on being able to just combo out. It is something that is a little bit more complicated and not necessarily something that I would recommend to be piloted or played by a newer player. But if this is something that you're interested in, I think she's a very unique commander, and I really love the direction that Boros got to take here. Do me a favor, as always, please make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel, like the video, and then also comment down below. What are some things that you would have liked to have seen included in this deck list? How would you have built this deck? I know that you could definitely do a completely different build entirely. In fact, you don't actually have to focus on artifacts at all.